It's Friday, January 6th, 2017. That's right, a new year and a new episode of the podcast. Is it 3000 NFL mock draft? Sure it is, but mostly we're going to be talking about the Seahawks and the NFL playoffs, which start this weekend on Saturday, January 7th, with the Seahawks taking on the Lions and the Raiders taking on the Texans. Leading into Sunday's games between the Steelers and the Dolphins, as well as the Giants and the Packers. We're going to focus a lot, of course, on the Seahawks, as this is always a Seahawks podcast. We'll talk about the championship game between Alabama and Clemson. We'll get into some of the draft-eligible players who have declared or not declared, and we'll talk about some of the draft order stuff going on. There is a lot going on, as it is January, of course, but I think the main focus here for anyone that is managing to be able to listen to this on Friday or Saturday, this will be a good podcast to listen to Saturday, the morning before the game, leading into the 5:15 p.m. PST kickoff between the Seahawks and Lions at CenturyLink Field. So we're going to get into it. Well, let's just get into it right away with the Seahawks, who finished the season 10-5-1 with a 25-23 win over the San Francisco 49ers. Somewhat concerning there to not get a convincing win that me and Rob had talked about last week over a very bad team, especially coming off their loss at home to the Cardinals. The Seahawks had a chance to go 8-0 at home, didn't pull that off. They went 7-1. They're going to have to win this home playoff game in order to advance the next round. And, the biggest takeaway there being the Detroit Lions, who have not won a playoff game in 25 years, who have not run a road playoff game in 60 years, have to go on the road with Matthew Stafford potentially suffering a broken finger on his throwing hand, and the defense being the worst in the NFL by DVOA. But the Seahawks, we don't know what Seahawks team we're going to get, as they have to beat a playoff team, and they're going to have to do it without Earl Thomas, without Tyler Lockett, without CJ Prosise. But I think there are things here for us to focus on that aren't going to necessarily be negative, but we do have to also face the reality. Rob, based on what you saw, and by the way, this is Kenneth Arthur with fieldgoals.com, and with me as always is Rob Staton of SeahawksDraftBlog.com, in case this is your first time tuning in to the podcast because of the playoffs or whatever. Rob, based on their 25-23 win over the 49ers and the way that they played in these last 4.5 games without Earl Thomas, what is your thoughts going into a playoff game, even one at home against the Lions?
Well, it's hard to know what to expect really this weekend because Seattle's been such a weird team this year, and especially in the last few weeks. You could sort of look through a real number of statistics to try and make an argument either way. I mean, I've seen things suggesting that Detroit's defense is really bad this week. In pretty much every facet, their defense has not been particularly good, but yeah, the reputation of the Detroit defense is that it is actually, better improving than perhaps they suggest. You could run through the Seahawks and see how their production defensively has dropped off a cliff since Earl Thomas's injury. You could look at Seattle's inability to run the ball. I mean, you could pretty much you could find any possible miserable stat about either of these teams going into the playoffs. And I'm not particularly worried in a way that I think a lot of people will be when they get to Atlanta. If they win and go to Atlanta next week, I think a lot of people will be sort of maybe watching that game through the fingers. But at the same time, I'm not particularly confident about the Seahawks' chances either. It's going to be one of those. I think a lot of people will be watching this game on Saturday with sort of, I would say, quite modest expectations. I think over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, when Seattle has got to the playoffs, people have almost expected a Super Bowl run. You watch the games believing that this is going to be a special season, whereas I think a lot of people will probably watch this playoff run thinking, every win's going to be a bonus, and let's see how far they can take it. So I don't think that that's going to be necessarily such a bad thing. Let's see if they can get a win in this game and progress and give themselves an opportunity to go to Atlanta and then see what they can do there. But it's not going to be easy, that's for sure. I think it'll be a pretty close game either way.
Well, what team? I had an idea in my head of how, if you were to compare this to a team that the Seahawks have played this year in the condition that the Seahawks are at right now with themselves. Which teams do you think favor most closely to the Detroit Lions? Since the Seahawks didn't play the Lions, if you were to compare them to another team and a game that the Seahawks played this year, what do you think would be some of the closest comparisons that you could come up with?
What if to games that Seattle has played this year? Do you mean?
Yeah. So if we were to look at another game and go, the way that we look at the Lions is maybe they've got a bad defense, but they've got a talented quarterback. They're not good at running the football. And if we could look at a game and say, because it's like if the Seahawks are playing, let's say that down the line, the Seahawks find themselves playing. The good news is there aren't a lot of teams like this in the playoffs right now. But let's say the Seahawks found themselves playing the Rams. Or found themselves playing against, a team that had someone like Aaron Donald who's just going to dominate the middle of their offensive line. That would be a team that worries me usually for the Seahawks is someone maybe who's going to dominate their offensive tackles or someone who can exploit deep center. Is there any teams that you think are sort of like the Lions?
Well, I guess looking at Seattle's schedule, maybe the nearest team is someone like Tampa Bay, who have, Jameis Winston there, who's a pretty good quarterback. And, you maybe make that comparison to Matt Stafford as well. They're both kind of sneakily mobile as well. And like Tampa Bay, I guess Detroit have got a couple of good receiving options there. And yet the running game is a bit, hit and miss. They don't have that really dynamic running back like someone like Arizona has in David Johnson. So, there's a lot of things you could sort of make the comparison there. The one thing that they don't have is someone like Gerald McCoy on the defensive line. And I think Seattle, when they played Tampa Bay, they obviously had Noah Spence there playing really well. And Detroit have got someone like Ziggy Ansah, but he's just been banged up this year. He's been injured. He's not playing to the same level maybe as Spence was playing when Seattle played Tampa Bay in that game. Plus, this is in Seattle; it's not in Tampa Bay. So I guess that would be the sort of the main difference there between the two. But if you were going to sort of look through Seattle's schedule, they might be the closest thing. And if I think if Matt Stafford hadn't got this injury, then Detroit maybe even been a little bit better than Tampa Bay. I watched Detroit win in Minnesota, for example. And the way they came from behind to win that game looked very impressive doing it. They've shown a lot of character this year, a lot of fourth quarter comebacks. So I think this injury to Matt Stafford has certainly hurt them, but they're still a dangerous team. And it's playoff time now. Matt Stafford might have been rusty with this finger injury in the last 3 weeks, but you'd expect that he's going to come to Seattle. Yeah, I'd be very surprised if he had a really bad game. And it's up to the Seahawks to try and contain this. They're going to play well against the run, you'd imagine, because they have all year. This is not a particularly potent running attack by Detroit. It's going to be really the key is going to be their ability to put points on the board themselves, for the offensive line to step up to the plate and have a big game. They've been a bit hit and miss as we've seen over the last few weeks. Let's see them have a consistent performance here up front in the offensive line, and let's see the defense get after this Detroit team. Let's see some belief that this pass rush can really sort of show them, put their best foot forward as well, because the pass rush in Seattle has been really streaky. And given that they've got Frank Clark and Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett, let's see those three really come together now and have a big performance and maybe compensate a little bit for the loss of Earl Thomas.
I'm looking to see if there's been any update on this today, but Tony McDaniel showing up on the injury report this week. It looks like maybe he's been ruled out, is what I'm seeing now. Which, how does that affect the Seahawks without Tony McDaniel? He's been up there for 16 games. He wasn't expected to be a part of the team up until the week before week one when they, or whatever, it was middle of August when they signed Tony McDaniel. It was just sort of out of nowhere, but everyone felt pretty good about that move. The Seahawks finished first in the NFL in yards per carry allowed. Tony McDaniel starting 16 games and putting up 40-plus tackles. And doing everything that had earned him a contract somewhere else after a couple years with the Seahawks. McDaniel was there when the Seahawks went to the Super Bowl both times, and now he's not going to be here for this playoff game. Another unexpected loss, just as much as unexpected for him to join the team in the first place. And it steps up John Jenkins into a a more significant role, I would assume, and he's only been here for 2 games. It's sadly reminiscent if you go back to like 2014, they started suffering injuries to Jordan Hill and other defensive tackles, and then they became vulnerable up the middle. Any thoughts on John Jenkins or, the way that Jaron Reed has played this year and how much that loss is going to be felt without Tony McDaniel?
Well, obviously, you'd rather play with Tony McDaniel, but I don't think it's going to be such a big loss because the one thing Detroit don't do that well is run the ball. Now, I think Zach Zenner's done a good job when he's played, but Detroit don't, or they haven't, at least in the games that I've seen, really commit to the running game. This is mainly about Matt Stafford, and the Seahawks have done a good job defending the run all year. Now, Tony McDaniel's been integral to that. We'll see if there's a big drop off between he and John Jenkins if he does in fact come in and play a few more snaps as a consequence of this. But the Seahawks still have Jaron Reed. They've still got a Taba Rubin. Maybe they will take up a few extra snaps in this game than they otherwise would do with Tony McDaniel in there. And because they've defended the run so well, I think this is going to be a game. This game ultimately, in terms of the Seattle defense, is going to be won and lost in the following region. Really, it's going to be their ability to pressure this quarterback and Matt Stafford. It looks as if Riley Reef might not play the right tackle, which means that because their backup is injured as well, I think they'll be on their third string right tackle. The Trey Swanson, the center, is questionable as well, so he might not play. It's a battered and bruised offensive line. Can the pass rushers get after Matt Stafford and give him a tough night? And it's going to be people in the secondary, like Steven Terrell, to essentially just don't make any mental mistakes. We don't need Terrell to be Earl Thomas necessarily. He just needs to avoid any basic errors. We can't see slants and little posts going 80 yards downfield. If he can just do his basic job and not give up any big plays in this passing game, then the Seahawks should be able to contain Detroit. And if people remember the last time the teams met on Monday Night Football last year, it really was only towards the end of the game that, Matt Stafford had one good drive, I think, in that game. One drive to put them in a position to try and win the game. And it was that final drive which resulted in the Calvin Johnson forced fumble from Ken Chancellor into the end zone, which was a remarkable play. That play doesn't get enough credit really because of the whole KJ Wright batting the ball out the end zone. People have focused on that and the rule that the referees got wrong, and not the sensational play, one of the greatest plays I think we'll ever see by Cam Chancellor. So, the Seahawks on that night did a pretty good job of containing Detroit. They don't have Calvin Johnson anymore. They don't have their running backs in this game, which they had in that game. And the defense maybe has just dropped a little bit since then as well. They were all over the Seahawks offensive line that night. That was one of the worst performances by Seattle's offensive line in the Pete Carroll era. So, if they can perform better than that, and I suspect that they will do, then the Seahawks are going to have a big opportunity to have a similar type of performance, I would imagine, in that game without maybe the need for the late drama.
When I asked earlier too about some of the teams maybe to compare to the Detroit Lions, a team that came to mind for me, or a game that came to mind for me, was Week 13 against the Carolina Panthers. Their teams don't necessarily have a bunch of similarities on paper, but I will throw some of them out there, which is that the game is at home, one. The number two is the game is on prime time on national television, where we know Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll have had a lot of success, which would be number two. Number three might be the number one quarterbacks, Cam Newton and Matthew Stafford, both, probably definitely the centerpieces for both of their teams playing, in these games, and having quarterbacks that have strong arms, but certainly have made questionable throws and mistakes and recently right now, though I think that Matthew Stafford is better than Cam Newton. Number four might be, just the fact that these teams are virtually may have been, about the same. Their Pythagorean win-loss was almost the exact same, around a 7.5 to 8.5, 7.5 wins, 8.5 losses, something like that. The Panthers were a little bit better than their 6-10 record. The Lions were a little bit worse than their 9-7 record. And so, like, I think that without that sort of, with some of those things going along the lines, and even Panthers having K1 Short and Starlo Tulele, and maybe it's another thing that's a little bit more of an Achilles heel for the Seahawks. As well, in that game against the Panthers, they didn't have Earl Thomas for most of the game because he broke his leg in that game, and the Seahawks came away with a 40-7 win. They put up 534 yards of offense in that game and 240 on the ground, which was by far their best rushing performance of the season. When you look at the Detroit Lions, I mentioned that they are last in defense by DVOA. When you look at some of the traditional stats, they're 31st in passing touchdowns allowed, 27th in net yards per attempt allowed, 20th in yards per carry allowed, 18th in total rushing yards allowed. When you break down that defense by DVOA, the Lions are 32nd against the pass and 23rd against the run. And I mean, we're talking about a team whose defense was worse than the Cleveland Browns, New Orleans Saints, the Indianapolis Colts, the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, this was, by Football Outsiders' perspective, the worst defense in the NFL. I don't know how many times a team that's been ranked dead last on defense in this category has even made the playoffs. But then we're looking across the other side, too, when you can look at the AFC and see that the Houston Texans are in the playoffs with the 30th ranked offense, unbelievably enough. And, you know, the Texans are even favored by most people to win this game this weekend against the Oakland Raiders because Derek Carr is out, Donald Penn is out. So the Texans could get a win there with a atrocious offense and an atrocious quarterback, whereas the Lions are in this position despite a terrible defense. And a lot of people point to the fact that the Detroit is just 13th in points allowed, which is interesting. But all of the other things point to that being the number of drives that they've actually had on the field. And the number of, they've won 9 games this year, but 8 of them by comeback variety. Can you go one way or another with a prediction of what you think Russell Wilson will look like in this game against this defense? And if Thomas Rawls / Alex Collins can get going, how did you think Collins looked last week?
Yeah, I thought Collins looked pretty good. I don't really understand. I mean, I guess the only reason they're persevering with Thomas Rawls, maybe to the extent that they are as the starter in quotes, is because they feel that he's got the upside and maybe the potential that if he can really get going, as we saw a little bit against Carolina, that he could be, you know, a major asset for the team. We saw what he did last year before he got injured and before he had that nasty injury, the ankle injury against Baltimore. You know, you could see what he was doing, and maybe they're sort of feeling that if he gets to that kind of level of performance, then he could be a real X factor in the playoffs. And they want to try and get that out of him, and maybe they don't feel that Alex Collins is capable of that. And yet you watch Collins, and he's hitting the line hard. You know, he's getting those extra yards that you can expect from a Seattle running back. He's getting the most out of his plays, and Thomas Rawls isn't quite doing that at the moment. Now, I've not studied every run, so it might be that the offensive line is just coincidentally doing a better job on those Collins runs than they are the Thomas Rawls runs, and that might be a part of it as well. But you know, it'll be interesting to see if it's more of the same in this game against Detroit. You know, if it's more of you know, Rawls toiling a little bit and Collins getting the yardage, whether they just turn to the hot hand and go with Alex Collins a little bit more. I mean, that certainly could happen. As for what we can expect from Russell Wilson, I don't think we really know. I mean, the positive thing is that since the second half of the Arizona game, he's kind of, the switch has flipped a little bit. I mean, I thought he looked good against San Francisco. He looked good in that second half against Arizona. He's not thrown an interception for a while now after that horrendous game against Green Bay. He had the one against Los Angeles. He had the one against Los Angeles, which was kind of a throwaway thing towards the end of the game. Apart from that, he's managed to avoid turnovers. He's looking crisp. He's looking sharp. You know, I would be confident, I guess, of going into this game thinking he's going to have a really good performance. I've noticed Ed Word has tweeted while we've been on doing the podcast there, Kenny, saying that he looks as if he might play without the knee brace for the first time in a few weeks, and that he feels healthier than he has at any point this year. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see Russell Wilson anywhere near 100% this year. I think there's every chance maybe in the off season he will have a little cleanup operation that we'll hear about. Maybe even when the season's over, Pete Carroll or Russell Wilson will reveal just how hurt he's been this year. I don't think he looks as sharp or as quick when he's running with the ball or as decisive, because I just think he looks like a guy who's had two pretty serious injuries this year, an MCL strain and a high ankle sprain. It's two very serious injuries that a lot of players would not be able to play through, and Wilson has been a warrior to do that. But it's certainly impacted his performance a little bit, and he isn't as dynamic as a runner or as a scrambler. He isn't quite as elusive as a consequence of this. So, you're never quite sure what you're going to see. But I guess the positive thing here, Kenny, is, there's no Calais Campbell, there's no Aaron Donald, there's no Gerald McCoy, there's no Fletcher Cox, there's none of these players in the playoffs, and while Green Bay's defense did give Seattle fits a few weeks ago, Seattle will not play Green Bay in Green Bay because they're the number 3 seed. So if the two teams are going to meet, it will be as an NFC Championship game in Seattle down the line. Atlanta's defense has got some nice parts. Vic Beasley's had a good year, but he's battling a shoulder injury. He will be dynamic off the edge, but it's not a defense that's got incredible interior presence that's going to destroy the offensive line. Detroit don't really have those guys, although if Ziggy Ansah gets going, then he could be a pain in the backside for them. There's one or two others as well, but I just think that there's an opportunity there maybe for Russell Wilson to show that he's a bit healthier, to show that he is one of the best in the game. I think this is his stage now. He's a franchise quarterback. This is when franchise quarterbacks essentially do their damage in the playoffs. Let's see if he can do that starting tomorrow.
When you look at the Seahawks with that run game, there's a lot of talk all season long. It's really been the thing that's followed Seattle's fans, I feel like, the entire time, from the questions of what the Thomas Rawls would look like after coming back from a broken ankle, to Kristen Michael having a good offseason and beginning of this season, to Rawls returning, to whether or not they should keep Troymaine Pope or Alex Collins, to the 12 running backs that they gave the ball to this year, to the 18 total players that had to carry this season, to everybody that's been a part of this team, from CJ Prosise being in for 6 games, to Terrence McGee and Marcel Reese now being a part of a potential playoff run, and Will Tukuafu and J.D. McKissick and George Farmer. So many running backs along the line. And yet here we stand in January of 2017, less than a year after the Seahawks drafted 3 running backs, after they, felt like they had something going with Thomas Rawls, and a lot of debate about whether or not Kristen Michael was better than Thomas Rawls, who is averaging 3.2 yards per carry, whether or not, they have to go back and now draft a running back early next year, whether or not they have to go and, sign someone. And I would also still remind everyone that even if you preferred Kristen Michael is a free agent who is going to, cost maybe $1-2 million a year. The reason that they kept Alex Collins instead of Kristen Michael is that Alex Collins is signed for 3 years at absolutely nothing, and he, I feel, still has a higher ceiling than Kristen Michael. Kristen Michael didn't get the job in Green Bay. He's just sort of a guy there right now. But the point being, what do you see now with Thomas Rawls after the 7 or so games that he's come back? When they first came back, those first 4 games where he was back, the running game looked better than it had all season, and now recently not looking as good. How do you address the running back position? Ignoring whatever happens in the playoffs right now, how do you think you address the running back position next year? Who are your guys, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say that you can look at Thomas Rawls and feel particularly confident that he's going to be the answer for the long term, which is a shame, because you're going to hate to say that, because he was so dynamic last year. And the issue for him is that sadly he's just been so injured, and it's tough. It's a tough reality about this business. If you can't stay healthy, then you kind of have to try and find guys who can. And it's that, and it's the offensive line's performance. There's a lot playing against the running backs on this roster. But if the Seahawks go into next year putting all of their eggs in the basket of CJ Prosise and Thomas Rawls again, and then the pair get injured within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the year, and this team can't run the ball again, we all know that they are going to get hammered. And rightly so, because the evidence was there that that they were a little bit injury prone and that they were susceptible to picking up issues. So I think whatever happens in this playoffs run, whether it ends tomorrow or it ends in a couple of weeks or it ends whatever, I think they're going to have to add at least one running back. They have to keep adding to this, and then people will debate and quibble about what kind of an addition that has to be. Is it just another guy who they draft in the middle rounds to add a body in there? Is it a veteran who they can either acquire or get in free agency to sort of add some competition in there? Is it a high draft pick that they're gonna put into the mix? Now, I mean, I guess the good thing about this draft class is there are players declaring now that were expected not to declare that could be of interest to the Seahawks. So Elijah Hood was initially set to return to North Carolina. He has since reneged on that and has sort of announced in the last few hours that he's going to turn pro after all. Now, he's got the kind of body shape and the physical profile the Seahawks looked for when he was at the Nike Spark Combine, I think in 2013. He had a tremendous workout. He is the type of player that traditionally over the years the Seahawks have really gone for. So, him declaring can only be a good thing. And he's the kind of guy who could go in maybe the 3rd round range, 4th round range, a little bit like CJ Pro size. So, I could imagine them looking quite clearly at somebody like Elijah Hood. That makes a lot of sense to me, that they would look at someone like him in the middle rounds, add him to the little group that they've got forming here, and then that just gives them a little bit of extra depth, so that if Rawls and Pro Size get injured again, you've still got Hood on the roster, you've still got Alex Collins presumably on the roster. You do have one or two different options there, so I could see something like that. There are other names in this draft, Deontay Foreman, and it'd be very interesting to see where he goes after his combine, or what kind of stock he has after his combine, because you sort of see real flashes of athleticism on tape for him at Texas, but you also wonder, he's a bigger guy, just how quick is he? His lateral mobility is really good, but again, just what is his physical profile? He was only a 2-star recruit, so let's see how good he really is at the combine. And there are others as well. I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot about Joe Mixon over the next few weeks now that he's decided to turn pro. For people who missed this, yesterday, Joe Mixon was told that he was given a 1st-round grade by the draft committee. Now, this is what I'd like to know. This is what I'd like to ask of people who know stuff about this draft committee is, how are they basing their decisions? Are they just looking at the tape and giving a judgment on what they see in terms of game performance, or are they taking a test of what NFL teams are saying about Joe Mixon? Because there's this incredibly violent video of Joe Mixon that is doing the rounds there. People will have seen this by now, and if they haven't, if you Google Joe Mixon, you will find it. But I would urge caution that it's quite an upsetting video. There has been a suggestion by Tony Pauline, who is without doubt for me the number 1 draft insider in the world. He's just consistently on the money with his inside info on the draft, and he was suggesting recently that teams or NFL Intel had given suggestions to Joe Mixon's people that he would go undrafted as a consequence of this video being published. So, is he been given the best advice here? Because while he might be a 1st-round talent on tape, and I think it's hard to argue with that, I don't expect that he's going to go in the 1st round of the draft. There's a very good chance he could go undrafted because of these issues. So it's quite a difficult one to work out, Kenny, because Tyreek Hill, everybody knows about Tyreek Hill, but people don't know that he had a similar issue going into the draft last year, and he ended up being, I think, a 5th or 6th round pick, and now he's become one of the most dynamic players in the NFL, and nobody seems to talk about his background. And yet, because of the video being out there, and because this has taken on a bit more of a high profile case, Joe Mixon might be treated a little bit differently throughout the draft process. He's going to have a bit more attention about him. The spotlight's going to be on him a little bit more. So it will be interesting to see how, one, he deals with that, and whether he can persuade a team or teams to believe that they want to take a chance on him early in the draft. I think it'll be surprising if they do, but this is going to be a storyline now for the next few months for sure.
Yeah, Tyreek Hill. I think that with that, you know, in the terms of whether or not people talk about Tyreek Hill, his background, I would say it's definitely not going to be to the degree of Joe Mixon because of the added publicity boost, if that's what you want to call it, from the video being released and everyone. Because in the same case of Ray Rice, it sort of is not discussed as much until, you know, everybody wants to, you know, share, like, look at that video and be able to say, like, okay, I saw what the mistake was. And, you know, I don't want to call it a mistake and say that it was like accidental. It was a purposeful act. But I do think people would talk about Tyreek Hill's thing. I think that if you asked Chiefs bloggers or writers, beat writers, people who tweet about Tyreek Hill, myself, I've tweeted about Tyreek Hill, and you can't do it without getting responses about, you know, him being, you know, his domestic violence past. It's the same way with Frank Clark. If I, you know, this season I tweeted out a sack count for Frank Clark every time he got a sack. And, you know, a lot of people will say, you know, something about a domestic violence situation, or, you know, how many battered women and these kinds of things. You know, Tom Cable, who is reportedly getting interest in head coaching positions for the San Francisco 49ers and maybe other ones he'll get an interview, is someone who in his past had broken the jaw of one of his assistant coaches, and had been reported in the news that there were 3 women who said that he had physically abused them. And that's not something that gets talked about very often. And, you know, the same way, whether it's with Joe Mixon or Ray Rice or Frank Clark or Tyreek Hill and so on, you know, that anybody that has it, there's still also got to be a question of at what point do you at what point are they forgiven? At what point are they allowed to pursue what they want to do? In the same way that if you worked at, you know, if you were a auto mechanic as opposed to someone in the, you know, public spotlight, at what point would you be able to, you know, go back to being an auto mechanic? Or, you know, if whatever the situation is, if in the situation of Tyreek Hill, my understanding is that since that moment, he has done nothing but everything that you would hope a person would do following something like that, which is apologize for what he had done, put in all of the work that he said he would do you know, that he was obligated to do, as well as, you know, pay the child support and alimony or whatever, everything that goes along with what he had done. And if he never does it again, who's to say that he can't be forgiven and move on? Joe Mixon, in the same way, he didn't say he didn't do it. He couldn't have said he didn't do it. But I don't think that he ever did. I believe that it was his side that released the video and said, well, if this is going to come out, look, this is what happened and I'm ashamed and this is what it is. And hopefully I can go pursue my dream if the teams want me. And that's the other thing, is that the teams will have to say that they will give Joe Mixon a chance. I'm sure that one of them will. I'm sure that several of them will vie for his services in the same way that we've seen Frank Clark and Tyreek Hill and other guys move on. You know, I've heard other criticisms of Frank Clark in that he didn't really take any accountability, perhaps, for actually doing it, rather than saying, you know, I think the side was more along the lines of denying that it happened in the way that the woman said that it happened. And maybe Frank Clark's not lying, but, you know, either way, we have the case of Joe Mixon or Tyreek Hill saying, you know, more along the lines of, I fucked up, I made a mistake, or, you know, I didn't do the right thing and I want to live my life to do the right thing. Maybe they're just saying what they think they need to say. Maybe it's genuine, but whether or not it's okay to give them that chance, it's a bigger question than I can answer. And it's certainly one that each fan has to morally, go with what their feeling is about the situation in order to move on and say, look, and, you know, you can take that opportunity to say, I'm not going to support the Seahawks. Do you think that if the Seahawks do draft a guy like Joe Mixon, it's a risk worth taking given that they've already gone down that path with Frank Clark? Or, you know, when you look at the situation with Adam Jones, who, you know, had gotten in so much trouble throughout his career with the Cincinnati Bengals and the Dallas Cowboys, and now actually the Titans and the Cowboys, and rebuilding his career and his persona with the Bengals until he was arrested this week or last week. And it's like you're right back at square one with Adam Jones, and you say that's what red flags are for, to stay away from guys like this. Do you have any of those concerns with the Seahawks adding someone else who has a domestic violence background? Do you think, from the sense of taking that risk, is it worth it?
I would probably say no. To the answer, the final question you said there, is it worth it? I would say no. I think that the problem is, and look, there's a real issue here, and there's a lot of different cases like this in the NFL. The NFL does not have, and I think this is something the NFL should have, a more definitive stance on domestic violence. It's quite clear on what happens if you do 3 pumps on a football field after you get a sack. Everybody knows the rule there. They're quite definitive on what happens if you smoke marijuana, for example, and yet with the domestic violence thing, the rule is not obvious. I mean, there are players and coaches in the league that have got this in their history, and and everybody's going to be treated a little bit differently there. And I think the problem with the Joe Mixon case is that I don't think it was handled well from minute one, really. I mean, with respect to the Tyreek Hill example, he was dismissed by Oklahoma State almost immediately after this news became apparent. If you think back to Frank Clark, he left Michigan or was sort of suspended from the team, Kenny, almost immediately after his incident as well. And yet with Oklahoma and Joe Mixon, there seemed to be quite a tepid punishment dished out by Oklahoma. I mean, he's played pretty much ever since for them. They protected him from the media to the point where he never really came forward. He didn't apologize straight away. From if memory is served, I've studied the story quite a bit. I don't think there was an immediate apology. And there's been a series of own goals along the way, Kenny. So a year ago, for example, he'd been protected from speaking to the media. He hadn't spoken to anybody about this. He hadn't made a public sort of statement in front of the press about what happened. Before the bowl game, if you remember, Oklahoma got to the college football playoffs a year ago. Before the bowl game, it was made clear that per the rules of the bowl game, every player needed to be made available to the press. So Joe Mixon, having not said anything until that point, was suddenly thrust in front of the media. And it was one of the worst press conferences I think I've ever seen, Kenny, because he was basically sat there in a chair with, press and media firing questions at him about this incident. And he'd obviously been told by either his legal representatives or the team or both not to say anything about this incident. And it just made for a really uncomfortable watch, because he just made sort of several references to he wasn't going to be talking about it. He wasn't going to talk about it. He wasn't going to talk about it. And it was tough to watch, because really what was required after this happened was Joe Mixon to come out and make an immediate apology, front up, ask questions about it, and then try and make amends, to the victim, and also to sort of be seen to be actively doing stuff in the community to show that he was going to learn from this and move on. And I don't think that happened at all. And then, after this sort of ham-fisted press conference that Oklahoma were forced into per the rules of the bowl game, another wall of silence. And then I think that the only reason he ended up speaking recently was again because it was another bowl game. The rules again insisted that he had to speak, and I think a press conference was called, if I'm not mistaken, for Christmas Eve, and there was very short notice given that they were actually going to do this press conference, and many members of the media who would have probably liked to attend that, were unable to because it's Christmas Eve. So I just think the whole thing has not been handled well by the school. The punishment was not befitting of the crime. I think you have to give other schools a bit more credit, like Michigan and Oklahoma State, for the way that they said, nope, we will not stand for this. We are not going to have this associated with our school. And they remove the players from their, from the team. Certainly not what Oklahoma have done. And because of the way that it's been sort of handled poorly, I would say, by Oklahoma, And because then the release of the video, what's going to happen is any team that essentially drafts the guy is just going to be, you can just see them. They're going to be sat down in front of the press on the day that he's drafted, and they're just going to be sent a load of furious questions about this whole thing. And then after that, they're going to be criticized, and then the criticism won't go away, and they're going to have to live with this for, however long. And then eventually, when he starts playing his career, you would imagine that the attention will again eventually begin to move on, because that's what happened with Frank Clark in Seattle, for example. There was a lot of attention about that, and then it's kind of moved away, and now hardly anybody brings it up, apart from maybe some of the tweets that you get, Kenny, and the occasional bit of social media stuff. It doesn't get mentioned in the mainstream media much at all. So this is the way of the NFL. I personally cannot imagine Pete Carroll and John Schneider sat in front of the press at the facility where they did the little press conferences after the war room, with people asking them again about another domestic violence case and why they felt they could take this guy when there was clear evidence of what he did. I cannot imagine that whatsoever. I think that the Seahawks will not be. I mean, if I'm wrong, then I'm sure we'll enjoy doing a podcast about this down the line, but and getting into this subject again. But I personally would be very surprised if the Seahawks went down this road, especially because there are going to be options in this draft at running back. I mentioned Elijah Hood earlier. He as a talent. Very few people. In fact, there's only probably 2 running backs in this entire draft class who are better in terms of a pure talent than Joe Mixon, and they're Fournette and Cook. But there are players in this draft that aren't bad either, and I think that with alternatives like Elijah Hood, who kind of fit the profile, the physical profile that the Seahawks like, I think that they will have enough alternatives to not feel tempted to do this. And it is a shame, Kenny. The whole thing's a shame. My great sympathies go to the victim in this. And I think it's a shame as well, because Joe Mixon, if he doesn't get the opportunity to play in the NFL, if he is sort of not drafted and not touched by these teams, it's going to be a great waste of his extreme talent. Because when you watch him, and I watched some of his stuff last night when he made this decision, Kenny, there is absolutely no doubt that he is a first-round talent. I mean, he is an incredible football player, but sadly for him, that's not going to count for much because of what he did.
And just transitioning there, with Frank Clark, in terms of the fact that he is a member of the Seahawks, and he has been for the last 2 years, and they're going to rely on him to win this playoff game and additional playoff games should they advance. And it's still pretty much, the NFL is still pretty much coming down to the quarterback play. Even if you look at the fact. When people talk about, and I've talked about this many times in the past as well, but when people talk about how you can win a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning, the version of Peyton Manning that we saw in 2015, which was one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, it wasn't that the reason was not because the Broncos necessarily won despite Manning. It's that the Broncos defense can make Cam Newton look worse. And that's the thing. It's still going to come down to quarterback play. The best teams and the best quarterbacks are right here in the playoffs. Most of the best quarterbacks are right here in the playoffs. Most playoff teams have a good quarterback, including Russell Wilson, including Matthew Stafford. And just as important as it is for the Seahawks to protect Russell Wilson is also important for the Seahawks to get to Matthew Stafford. When they get out there and when they are able to pressure the opposing quarterback, they are obviously going to play better. And Frank Clark, 23 years old, he had 10 sacks. He's in the double-digit sacks for a single season now. When he was drafted, and we did our podcast during the draft, you compared him to Jadeveon Clowney, and the size-wise and the physicality and the type of prospect that he could have been coming into Michigan to what he came out, whether or not he would have been a top 15 pick if it weren't for the domestic violence history. And, now here he is in his second season, and he could have another 10, 15 years, 10, 13, 12 years ahead of him if he is able to keep his nose clean. And I think he's the youngest player in Seahawks history to ever get 10 sacks in a single season. It's something to really behold when you look at the type of pass rusher, the type of defensive lineman that the Seahawks could have with Clark if he's able to, stay as a good guy outside of the field to not get in any more trouble, to not make that look like a huge mistake. Rob, you watch every Seahawks game. You know Frank Clark from his days in Michigan. You knew that he was a great prospect from a football standpoint. What do you see as a pass rusher? You know, as the Seahawks have extended Michael Bennett, they're going to have Bennett, Averill, Frank Clark for the next 2 seasons. It should give them an advantage if those 3 guys, they're the best trio in the NFL at sacks this season. It gives them a dangerous weapon in the playoffs and as well as the next 2 years. What did you see from Frank Clark this year? And if just assuming from a football standpoint, what type of player could he be now that we've seen him put together a 10-sack season?
Well, he was incredible at Michigan. I know because of the because of the stuff with his character background and because of the domestic violence case, that a lot of people maybe didn't watch the Michigan tape or sort of want or feel like they wanted to really consider him to be a Seahawk. I watched a lot of the Michigan stuff that he had, and he was incredible. And without that lingering in the background, I think teams would have considered Frank Clark in the top 15 and 20 picks of that draft. I mean, that he was without a shadow of a doubt a top 15 talent who ended up being available in round 2 as a consequence of the domestic violence case. And what we're seeing is in the NFL is just that incredible physical talent translate to the pros. I mean, there are not many people with Frank Clark's physical profile. I mean, he is phenomenal. I mean, the way that he tested at the combine, is incredible athlete, powerful, fast, dynamic, really good player. And we've seen that this year. I think the key thing for him, as he sort of moves through his career now, is to get to a point where he takes over games. That's what I want to see from him moving forward, because he's got the production now. But I want to see him consistently take over games. And that is what the best players will do. If you remember Cam Jordan when Seattle played New Orleans, he just suddenly, just smacked you in the face kind of performance in the way that he just suddenly took it over. And he just leapt off the screen. And it was like, wow, this guy can... it just suddenly started dominating, and you don't really get that sense with Frank Clark. He will get a sack here and there. He collects these stats, but I don't think we've seen him sort of really have a game where you think, player of the game, Frank Clark. His constant pressure there and the way that he dominates in that offensive line. That he's the player of the game. I don't think we've seen that from him yet, and that's something that he can aspire to be. In the way that we hear teams talk about Michael Bennett, and we've got to work a way out to do this, and he's one of the best pass rushers in the league, and we've got to find a way to stop him. You've seen Cliff Averill take over games. I think that's what we want to see from Frank Clark moving forward. And I always remember that. If you remember when Patrick Kearney had his kind of 14 sack season. Patrick Kearney never quite took over games for Seattle. It was kind of like he'd be quiet in a game, and then he'd get a sack. And then, he did that 14 times over the course of the year, and everyone was afterwards like, yeah, really good player. But I never quite felt that he was like a dominant defensive lineman pass rusher. It was just that he kind of generally collected stats throughout the course of the year. And I think that's, can Clark go from somebody who has an impact at times in games and collects the numbers to somebody who is taking over games and dominating and becoming one of the NFL's best. And he's got plenty of time to achieve that. As you mentioned, Kenny, he's very young. I think he's only 24. So over the next couple of years, hopefully he's got a chance to do this. He could develop into one of the best pass rushers in one of the best defensive linemen overall in the NFL. He's got that potential. So it'll be interesting to see if he can deliver on that moving forward. And I think that all signs are very encouraging on Frank Clark in terms of his character and in terms of his performance on the field.
If we're going to take just a quick look before we circle back on the Seahawks and the Lions game, if we circle around to the rest of the NFL playoff games this weekend, before the Seahawks play the Lions, the Oakland Raiders will take on the Houston Texans. And I just wrote an article today, or I wrote it earlier in the week, but it posted today on rollingstone.com. You can check that out, rollingstone.com/sports. For my article on the Texans and Raiders game, and wondering whether or not this was the worst wild card matchup in NFL history. I went through all of and just based mostly on quarterbacks. This game is Brock Osweiler versus Connor Cook. And we talked about Connor Cook quite a bit on this podcast last year. Rob, you were not a fan of Connor Cook. from a personality standpoint. And, he he was in the 4th round of the draft. At one point during his career at Michigan State, he could have been a much higher draft pick. And the Raiders took him somewhat surprisingly in the 4th round. And it looks like be what gets them that first playoff start that they've had since 2002 will be started by Connor Cook, who had an embarrassing moment last year when he took that award from Archie Manning, or whatever, in the way that he did it, and not being voted captain by his teammates. And now here he is in the playoffs. And then Brock Osweiler, who I sort of started this campaign against him. Sorry, Brock, you seem like such a nice guy. I'm just coming from a football standpoint and just thinking this guy is so bad. Like, he's not a good starting quarterback. The Texans gave him $72 million. I wrote that the Texans shouldn't give him that contract before they even gave him a contract. And they did it, and they gave him this money, and he's benched 3 weeks ago for Tom Savage. But Tom Savage is, hurt, and, he wasn't playing great. So now you've got Brock Osweiler versus Connor Cook, and it could be the worst of all time. If you look, and another thing in that article is the fact that ESPN keeps on getting these terrible wild card games the last 3 years. Last year was Brian Hoyer throwing 4 interceptions against the Chiefs. 2 years ago, it was the Cardinals and the Panthers with Ryan Lindley going up against the Panthers, one of the worst quarterbacks in NFL history, Ryan Lindley. And I went back into the history, and I found maybe that there was one worse game than this one, which was Steve DeBerg versus Todd Marinovich in 1991, Kansas City against LA Raiders, with Todd Marinovich, who was barely in the NFL, only got drafted because of his career leading up to USC, the way he was this perfectly molded kid to become a quarterback, and it didn't work out at all. But now you've got Osweiler versus Cook. Most people are picking the Texans because the Raiders will not have Derek Carr, who was having an MVP type season. Not my MVP, and definitely probably not most people. Some people have made the argument, some people up top definitely made the argument for Derek Carr, and then Brock Osweiler for the Texans. Just the fact that they will have Clowney going up against, their backup left tackle for the Oakland Raiders because Donald Penn is out. What are your thoughts going into this game right now? It's another dud for ESPN. It's a really bad matchup. And your guy, Connor Cook, starting in the playoffs. What do you think?
Yeah, it's not a game to savor, is it? And the whole Connor Cook thing. I remember sort of like a year ago, Kenny, people were talking about Connor Cook going in the first round, and we haven't often talked about the things we've discussed on this podcast that have come true. But Connor Cook sort of flopping down the draft into round 4 is one of the things that we definitely got right. I mean, we foresaw this happening, and I can't imagine that he's going to have a long, successful NFL career unless he somehow leads Oakland on an improbable Super Bowl run here. It's not a game that's particularly interesting. I love the fact it was Greg Rosenthal who came up with this, but he made the joke recently on Twitter that the Raiders-Texans game is the first playoff game without playoff implications. That whoever wins this game is going to essentially just get knocked out in the next round. So he's probably correct on that. It's a shame for Oakland because I remember actually waking up on Christmas morning feeling sort of a little bit down in the dumps because Seattle had just blown the number 2 seed, having lost to Arizona. And I remember thinking, God, imagine being an Oakland Raiders fan, that you woke up on Christmas Eve thinking, game tonight, come on Raiders, chance to win the Super Bowl, playing really well, Derek Carr looks great, you play the game. I think they played the Colts, didn't they? You play the game against the Colts. Oh, Derek Carr's broken his leg. And you wake up on Christmas Day, and you've gone from waking up on Christmas Eve thinking Raiders got a legitimate chance to win a Super Bowl. You wake up on Christmas Day, season's over. Quarterback's broken his leg. Is he going to recover from this? How is he going to be next year? And it's almost like torture for the Raiders now that they have to actually suffer this playoff run. I imagine there are Raiders fans out there who just think, just get on with the end of the season. Let's just get, it's over. We know it's over. Don't make us watch these playoff games. Don't tease us with a playoff game now and potentially 2 playoff games. let's just get on with the off season. Let's regroup. Let's get Derek Carr healthy. Let's come back next year as well. I imagine that's how a lot of Raiders fans are feeling about this. And it's tough for them because in the background of all of this, if you were an Oakland Raiders fan in Oakland, you're thinking, well, the team might leave in the next, just as the team's starting to come good, just as Derek Carr maybe goes and wins a Lombardi Trophy, it might be as the Las Vegas Raiders or something, or the Los Angeles Raiders. So it's tough for the Raiders fans. I feel for them. Because of that, I partly hope that they win this game. Because they've been a really fun team to watch this year, and I still really like Bruce Irvin and everything that he represents. So, I'm kind of rooting a little bit for the Raiders to win this one. I would just love someone to, I just don't want it to be as predictable as everybody's thinking, Kenny, in the AFC. I want to watch, and this, I don't have any real beef with New England. They beat Seattle in a Super Bowl. Good job to them for that. I think you have to respect Tom Brady. I quite like Tom Brady, to be honest. I know it's not, a lot of people don't, but I don't mind him. I like the fact he can laugh at himself a little bit with some of the videos he's posted on social media. And, you have to kind of respect what Bill Belichick has done. So I don't dislike the New England Patriots. I just would like it to be a little bit more unpredictable than maybe people think. And I would quite like to see somebody beat them. I don't think we're going to find that team from this group. It might have to be the Chiefs or the Steelers, but it'd be nice to have a bit of intrigue in the AFC side of the draw, because the way that it's playing out, it looks like it's going to be a bit of a saunter into the Super Bowl for New England.
Yeah, I mean, I got to just focusing on the Texans and Raiders. It's got to go with Houston at home with the superior defense. I think obviously if Derek Carr had not been hurt, I don't even think we're talking about this game. We're talking about Chiefs at Texans, and then you're talking about the Chiefs, I think, advancing in that matchup with the Raiders getting a first round bye. And that's how that's how unfortunate things were for Oakland. In the same way, these teams, these franchises, Oakland, Detroit, Detroit blew their opportunity to win that division by losing their last 3 games. And here we are. Of course, it's going to be the Packers getting the division and the Lions, because that's the way it's always been. Of course, the Raiders are going to blow their chance to have a first round bye. Not necessarily, it's just not like blow it like they played poorly. Just they did play poorly, because who does have someone as good as Derek Carr backing up Derek Carr? Not very many teams will ever have something like that. But, on the bright side, they are in the playoffs for their fans. And then you can think about next year coming back with Carr and Cooper. There's lots that they can get that defense better, that they can start to really become a contender against New England, just as Tom Brady is starting to hit age 40. So something to think about there. Texans got to win that one. In terms of the other AFC matchup, the Dolphins and the Steelers, it's interesting that Miami in that week 1 game against the Seahawks, they lose 12-10 with a last-minute touchdown to Doug Baldwin for Seattle to pull out the win at home. But Miami, at the time, I don't think any of us thought that the Miami Dolphins were going to be a playoff-type caliber team. And here they are at 10-6 in the first season under Adam Gase. You've had a lot of praise for Gase here on the podcast, and here he is, because he's gotten them to the playoffs despite Miami being outscored during the season. They are here. They do have some players on offense and defense that are quite interesting and good, though it's interesting that they are 30th in rushing yards allowed, 31st in yards per carry allowed, just 26th in passing yards allowed. And Ryan Tannehill, getting injured, and he'll be out as he's recovering from the ACL and MCL sprains. And that's really going to be difficult for them to get a win on the road in the playoffs with Matt Moore, especially against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Is this going to be a competitive game?
Hope so. I like what Miami have done this year, and the way that they've brought everything together is similarly representative of kind of like the Seahawks in 2012. The momentum's been building there. They've gone on this kind of like, after a bit of a mixed start, it really came together under a new coach, new regime, new identity, and you could kind of see that with Miami. And they've been one of the sort of success stories of the season, really. But they lose Ryan Tannehill. I don't think the drop from Tannehill to Matt Moore is that significant. I still think that they're going to be competitive in this one. And you never quite know what you're going to get from the Steelers. This is a Steelers team, Kenny, that was absolutely hammered by Philadelphia, who came back down to earth with a bang, didn't they, after a few weeks after that game. this is a Pittsburgh team that have, really struggled at times in other games as well. And yet they've also been incredibly impressive. I mean, the way that they won the game against Baltimore on Christmas Day, you've got to give them props for that. Le'Veon Bell looks terrific. Antonio Brown, Big Ben, they've got players that can beat anybody. Defensively, they're not that strong though, and this is, this is the thing with the flawed NFL this year. You feel like you can have success against that Pittsburgh defense, and if you can just sort of condense and restrict Big Ben, if you can get some pressure on him, he's always good for a big interception, Roethlisberger. So Miami can go into that with some confidence, but I would still expect Pittsburgh to win, and I think that they're going to be a real threat there. They could potentially be a threat to New England if they meet.
When we look at the other NFC matchup, which could have, obviously implications on Seattle down the line. If the Seahawks win, then we know they're going to play the Falcons. If they lose, well, who cares? So if they win, we know they're going to play the Falcons. But if they get to the NFC Championship, then implications can start to be had with this Giants-Packers matchup. The game in Green Bay, it's supposedly so cold that they might not even sell out the game. That there's a danger that the Packers won't sell out a home playoff game at Lambeau because of how cold it's going to be, something like 9 degrees or something like that. And the Giants, I think an interesting thing that's going on with the Giants right now is, when you look at the Denver Broncos a year ago, when they went into the playoffs, most of the focus was on how bad, their defense or how bad their offense was and how bad, Peyton Manning and Brock Osweiler were. But I don't think that people were really talking about them having a historic defense, in the way that we talk about them now, in the way that we can look at it now. And especially even though you can look at it right now, that even though Denver didn't make the playoffs, interestingly enough, they had 2 cornerbacks as first-team All-Pro, Aqib Talib and Chris Harris. That's never happened before. Same team, 2 cornerbacks, first-team All-Pro. Denver finished first in defense DVOA again this season. But the New York Giants, I think that there's a chance that we will exit these playoffs and, 6 months down the line, be talking about the New York Giants' elite historic defense in a way that we aren't talking about them right now. The Giants have gone, I disagree so much with going out and trying to improve through free agency. It doesn't work so many times, and yet the Giants make me look like a fool as they have gone from 30th in defense to 2nd in defense, 4th against the pass, 3rd against the run. I mean, there's a myriad of stats out there about the number of touchdowns they allowed. The way that Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie has played this season at cornerback, just shutting people down. Landon Collins up for Defensive Player of the Year. Damon Harrison coming out, the defensive tackle that they signed. Olivier Vernon, he actually surprisingly playing better than I expected him to play after they gave him an $85 million contract. Janoris Jenkins, the cornerback from the Rams, who went to the Pro Bowl this year. It's been named a Pro Bowler. Jason Pierre-Paul coming back from his hand injury to be a very impactful player, going beyond the 7 sacks. And here they are with a very good defense, but they do have to beat Aaron Rodgers, who's red hot, and you have to do it at home in the playoffs. A very interesting matchup. This could be the game of the weekend, but I do see pretty much where I've been looking so far, which isn't that many places, but I do see the Packers as the unanimous pick. Rob, is it that simple for you?
I mean, I don't think it's that simple, but I think that it's looking like Green Bay are the team potentially to beat in this playoffs, just because of the way that Aaron Rodgers is playing now. That's no disrespect to Dallas, of course. I guess that they're still the team to beat, only because they're the number 1 seed. They've played so well this year, but just watching Rodgers and the swagger that he's playing with, and the form that he's got at the moment, it's going to take something special to stop him. It's easy to forget that just a couple of years ago, they were within one of the craziest comebacks we'll ever see, from beating the Seahawks in Seattle and potentially going there and winning the Super Bowl against Tom Brady and the Patriots. So, this is a team that is very, very capable of launching a Super Bowl run. They're going to be at home. They're very comfortable at home at Lambeau, of course. And Eli Manning, is going to need to sort of channel some of his 2011 self to have a chance of winning this one. The defense could keep them in it. I mean, they've played very well on defense, as you mentioned there. You know, they've done well with the moves they made in free agency have actually all come off, which is kudos to the Giants for that. You know, they've got some of that what they had a few years ago in terms of the pass rush and what they've got up front on the defensive line. Secondary's playing well. Landon Collins could be a defensive MVP candidate. And then on offense, you know, Eli and Odell Beckham will always cause teams problems. The one thing they haven't got is much of a running game, and that's one of the big things they're missing. And the offensive line is not great, so that could be a counter for them. And Rodgers is making up for a lot of ills on that Green Bay team just because he is sensational. I mean, I maybe he needs to win another couple of championships, Kenny, to sort of really deliver on and sort of get the respect that he deserves. But I think Aaron Rodgers should rightly be remembered whenever he does retire as arguably the greatest quarterback that's ever lived. I mean, his quarterback rating is better than anybody else's ever. Just a naturally sensational player. And when he hits top form as he has in the last few weeks, he's virtually unstoppable. I mean, he played so well against Seattle. I know there was a lot of turnovers in that game from Seattle, but you know, he's the only one. It's an Aaron Rodgers Green Bay team that is the only team in 5 years that has blown out the Seahawks. And I think there's something behind that. And the way that they've played, the way that they won that division, the way that they came back from looking like they were out of it to winning the division and winning the last 6 games. I would not want to face them in the playoffs. They're the kind of team that you want somebody else to eliminate so that you don't have to play them. I guess from the Seahawks' point of view, I guess they would be willing to play them because if the Seahawks do play them, they'll be at home in the NFC Championship game. And it'll mean 1, they got to the NFC Championship game, and 2, they'll get a chance to be at home in that game. But the rest of the teams, you know, like I honestly believe that the Dallas Cowboys, as much as they've already lost twice to the Giants already, they will be rooting for the Giants in this game. They will not want to play Green Bay. They'll want another a shot at the Giants. It's very hard to beat the same team 3 times in a year, especially when they're a 13-3 team. So I think Dallas will fancy their chances if they get a 3rd match against the Giants. I don't think Dallas will necessarily look forward to playing this Green Bay team. So I think Green Bay will win. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. But if Green Bay do win, watch out, because they could easily be the representative of the NFC in the Super Bowl.
Well, I will flip that, and I will say, you know, and I know there are going to be a lot more people on the side of Green Bay and them being the most dangerous team than my opinion, which is that the New York Giants are the most dangerous team in the NFC from the standpoint that I think the Cowboys are the best team in the NFC, and I think that the Cowboys are probably going to go to the Super Bowl. But as far as anyone else being the team to sneak through, I'm going to go with the New York Giants. You know, this is exactly the place that the New York Giants are always at when they do make their Super Bowl runs with Eli Manning. You know, the team has gone 8-1 in their last 9 playoff games with 2 championships. Every single year, it seems to, every time that happens, it seems to be that they're just headed on a just train track straight to the Super Bowl against the New England Patriots. It's going to be Giants, Patriots once again. You're going to have Odell Beckham become a Super Bowl MVP. It's all setting up for this Odell Beckham show in the playoffs this year. They have the number 1 defense in the playoffs. Nobody has a defense that's even comparable to theirs in the playoffs because the Denver Broncos didn't make it. The Arizona Cardinals didn't make it. The Philadelphia Eagles didn't make it. The Baltimore Ravens didn't make it. Those are 4 of the 6 other teams that are
Well, we appear to have lost Kenny temporarily. I'll stick with this for now, just in case there's a chance that he will return to the chat here and continue his point on the New York Giants. He was just talking about how the Giants are going to be good there. I think he's got some fair points to make, especially in terms of whether the defense is playing. You would imagine that they're going to give themselves a great chance in this playoff run. I'm sure if he returns in the next few moments, he will come on and offer the counter to this. I guess the issue that I have with the Giants personally is just the way that they do not run the ball particularly well. It does make them a little bit one-dimensional. Eli Manning is not a young guy anymore. He's still towards the twilight of his career now, well into his 30s. He has not played as well as he has in the playoffs in 2011 in a long time. And while Odell Beckham is a very productive player, very difficult for, just to have a receiver and a quarterback sort of driving an offense forward. So especially when you have to go somewhere like Green Bay in the cold there, with the way that Green Bay are playing. So, they'll have an opportunity to win this game, but certainly they'll be relying, I think, on the defense and that quarterback receiver combination. If they could get a little bit more out of the running game, that would help as well. But it's going to be a fascinating game either way. Certainly would think that'd be a very, very interesting game there between the Giants and the Packers. Probably the game of the weekend. Hopefully the Seahawks game is not going to be overly interesting, and the Seahawks are going to have a nice, solid, comfortable win in this one. Just waiting to see if Kenny's going to return here to the chat. We are live. As he posted the link on Twitter as well. So we'll see if he is going to return in a couple of moments here. We just happened to lose Kenny. If he's not back in a couple of minutes, I think we'll just wrap this up and that'll be the end of the podcast for this week. But hope you've enjoyed it so far. The Seahawks playing the Lions tomorrow, and Houston taking on Oakland as well before the Green Bay game, and Pittsburgh, as we discussed a little bit earlier, on Sunday as well. So lots of playoff football coming up. Do not look like Kenny is going to be back with us. So unless he returns in the next couple of minutes, I'll just say, look, thanks for joining us. You can check out more of Kenny's stuff, of course, on Field Goals. You can, if you want to read about the draft and the off season a little prematurely, hopefully, fingers crossed, and Seahawks draft blog as well is where you will find me. And whether the Seahawks make a big Super Bowl run or not over the next few weeks, we'll have a lot of coverage with the Senior Bowl coming up at the end of this month. The Combine to look forward to as well. We know the draft order of the top 20 teams as well, so we're getting into a lot of interesting stuff there too. So you can join us on Seahawks draft blog. Good community of people there talking about the next draft class, which is going to be a very intriguing draft class as well, loaded with talent coming up in this draft. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter as well, at Field Goals for Kenny, and at Rob Staton for me as well. So thanks for joining us for this edition of 3000 NFL Mock Draft, and we'll see you soon.
Looks like I got kicked out there or something. Get this back on track if possible. Rob, can you hear me?
Yes, what happened there?
I don't know. I was talking and then I stopped talking and I looked at it and I was kicked out. Did you do you know where I stopped? You stopped hearing me?
Yeah, it was right to the point you were talking about the Giants and the Packers there.
Oh, I don't know how much of it was cut off.
It was most of it was cut off. I mean, you were talking about Odell Beckham potentially having a big playoff run here.
All right. Well, my point was, I guess that's probably better for everyone. You didn't have to hear my rant. I picked the Giants to win the game, and I believe the Giants are the most dangerous team in the NFC as far as the teams that aren't getting a bye week this week. And I think that it works in Seattle's favor if the Giants knock off the Packers right now, and if the Seahawks somehow get through the next two games, and the Giants can beat the Cowboys and go 3-0 against them this year, then suddenly the Seahawks are hosting the Giants in the NFC Championship. It's not outlandish to see something like that happen. I think when you've got Eli Manning's, winning 8 of his last 9 playoff games, when you've got Odell Beckham as, a star player, when you've got, I could just envision it happening with Victor Cruz making a David Tyree type play. And when you've got the 2 cornerbacks in the way that the Broncos had last year, with them having Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie and Janoris Jenkins, plus guys in the backfield with Landon Collins and guys up front with Damon Harrison and Jason Pierre-Paul, it just all comes together for me to see the Giants and the Patriots sort of maybe going on to that headway once again. So I do pick the Giants in this game, and I think that they are a team that could really quote unquote surprise people, because when they're 12th in DVOA, they're just primed to win the championship. And that's sort of why I'm picking the Giants. And I circled back to the Seahawks and the Lions to just ask if you, because I don't think we ever like really laid it out, if you have a prediction for the Seahawks and Lions game.
A prediction for the Seahawks-Lions game? It's very difficult to predict it just because of the way that the Seahawks have been so streaky recently. I could easily see a close game where maybe similar, tight and close, and maybe the Seahawks get a defensive score or something late in the game just to pull away. I could see something like that, not too dissimilar to the divisional round game against Carolina in 2014. I could see it being very close and coming down to a field goal. I can definitely imagine the Seahawks losing the game because you just don't know what you're going to get from them recently. So I'll go with something like 20-10 to Seattle, but I say that, more out of more what I hope than I genuinely have a gut feeling about. I mean, anything could happen in this game. The Lions could win, the Seahawks could win. It's going to be very difficult to call, I think.
Technical difficulties, perhaps on the podcast so far right now. Rob, if do you want to give that another shot to see if your microphone comes on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know how much you caught that, Kenny. But
most of it.
I was suggesting that I think it could be 20-10, and I say that not so much because I have a really firm gut feeling that this is going to happen. I kind of hope it's going to be that way, but I can imagine any result, including a Lions victory in this one. I think it could go either way.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's going to be a lot more points than you normally would expect because the Lions don't have any defense. The Seahawks don't have Earl Thomas. I think that the Seahawks will be able to, get in rhythm offensively early in a way that they, typically struggle with, but they won't have as many struggles at home on prime time against the 32nd ranked defense. I think that you're going to see Russell Wilson, Jimmy Graham, and Doug Baldwin really get moving, put a few points on the board, maybe go up early, and hopefully they can revert to a running game with Thomas Rawls and Alex Collins and really put it down. I think that the Lions will have their successes with Golden Tate up the middle, and with Matthew Stafford, there could be really frustrating times for Seahawks fans. But overall, I think there will be more points than normal, but I still think the Seahawks will win something akin to maybe 31-20, 31-18, something like that. I think that they are just the better team right now, but especially being at home, it'll feel a little bit better. That being said, if they lost 14-9, I wouldn't say that I was surprised either, because this team just doesn't do what you expect it to do. The way that I see it on paper, I see the Seahawks winning and there being a lot of points. The way that I sort of understand it as a person who's watched the games this year, they could lose 10-9. So, that's sort of how I'm seeing it right now. And just because I think I promised it earlier on, we haven't talked about anything else other than the NFL playoffs. Since that we last had a podcast, the Washington Huskies lost to Alabama, and the Ohio State Buckeyes lost to Clemson. Both pretty easy victories for both Alabama and Clemson as we get a rematch of last year's championship game. How did you think the Huskies played against the best team in the country by a wide margin? How did you think the Huskies played in that game? And how does this championship game compare to last year's championship game?
Well, I thought the Huskies played quite well. I mean, they gave them a game. Obviously, the turnover, the pick six before halftime really completely changed that game. It made it, what would have been a 3-point game, and it's close and it's tight, and you don't know, like margin of error for both teams have been pretty small. Alabama went into halftime sort of feeling really good about themselves. So that was a significant moment. I think the sort of the 3rd and 8 run from when Alabama were sort of pinned deep in their own territory, the Huskies a chance to get good field position and maybe get back into the game. And then Bo Scarborough had that really strong run. And then, they it was like a hot knife through butter after that. And he ended up scoring the touchdown, didn't he? And then it was game over. So the Huskies certainly didn't let themselves down. But Alabama are just this, you really do have to play almost a perfect game against Alabama. You have to be really tight defensively. You have to have a good idea to contain the quarterback and his movement. It's interesting that, we've barely seen anything from Bo Scarborough all year, and yet he has a really big game in this one. And it just goes to show the extreme number of ways Alabama can beat you. And this was another example of that. And that defense is it's just so good, Kenny. I mean, there's going to be sort of 4 or 5 first-round picks in this draft alone. From that Alabama unit, there'll be first-round picks on that roster that go in the future as well. It's an incredible team. As for what we expect from the national championship this year, I would expect it to be a little bit more comfortable for Alabama. It was a very interesting game last year. I'm not counting out Clemson. I mean, they will have a chance, but I think that Alabama will win this one fairly comfortably. I would predict a little bit more comfortably than they did last year. And they have just been a phenomenal team, possibly the best that Nick Saban has had during this run. And I hate to say it, but although they're going to lose a lot of good defensive talent this year, they're probably only going to get better because Jalen Hurts is a true freshman. And as he gets older and more mature and more comfortable as a quarterback, I think that they're going to get even better.
And in terms of the people declaring or not declaring, you mentioned Isaiah Hood earlier in the podcast. Is there any of those people declaring or not declaring that were really notable to you?
What, in terms of the draft overall recently?
Did any of the declarations kind of disappoint you? Has there been notice from Garrett Bowles? What's going on there?
Yeah, Garrett Bowles is going to declare. So good for him. I mean, he's a really good player, the best left tackle in the country. I'm glad that he's getting the respect that he deserves now. I'm seeing more and more people not just mocking him in the first round, but correctly putting him in the sort of top 15, 20. I mentioned with the sort of little asterisks whenever I mocked him to the Seahawks during the year that I'm going to do this until other people start saying it's not going to happen, that he's going to go early. I'm not seeing him in any mock drafts. So I'm going to give myself the opportunity to place him with Seattle until I, see reason to think that he's going to go a lot earlier. And then, people have started doing it. So now I'm resigning myself, that he's not going to be anywhere close to the Seahawks. I did a mock draft yesterday and put Garrett Bowles in the top 10, which is where he belongs. He's an incredible player. There's not been any major surprises. Everybody we expected to declare pretty much has. I think the biggest surprise is probably Joe Mixon because he was initially suggesting that he would return to Oklahoma. Then he's now declared. He got this first round grade from the draft committee. Like I say, we're still waiting on some other players. What is Mitch Trubisky going to do? What are some of the Alabama players going to do? So still a bit of time yet. I think there's about another 10 days before players have to make a final decision. But already, Kenny, it's looking like an incredible draft class. I think it's going to be a really intriguing one. It's going to be fascinating to watch this develop over the next few months, with the Senior Bowl and then the Combine. I'm going to be taking some time off work to watch the Combine again and do another live blog there. It's one of my favorite times of the year. I'm going to be doing it probably with a newborn baby screaming in the house as well. So that's going to be an interesting challenge, battling a bit of adversity to focus on the Combine with a lack of sleep and a baby in the house. But it's going to be a really intriguing draft class overall.
And just one other thing is the All-Pro rosters being announced today, and 3 rookies ending up on that with Ezekiel Elliott, Tyreek Hill, who we talked about as a returner, and Jack Conklin, the tackle for the Tennessee Titans. Quite impressive for any rookie tackle to get an All-Pro nod off the bat. It's very rare, and to get recognition in the offensive line for any rookie right off the bat is, super hard to do, and it gives him an opportunity to do something that few offensive linemen or people in NFL history can do, which is, get on a run of, All-Pro or something like that early on. and go down with the greats. Is Jack Conklin one of the greats? And, do you think that long term we're still looking at him as the tackle above a tackle class that included Laramie Tunsil and Ronnie Stanley and Taylor Decker, who the Seahawks will see this weekend with the Lions?
Yeah, possibly so. I mean, he's had a really good start. Sometimes circumstance is the big thing. Without a shadow of a doubt, Jack Conklin has benefited from the fact that offensive line. I mean, they started this year with 3 top 10 picks on the offensive line. Taylor Lewan, Jack Conklin, and Chance Warmack. And if you were putting that kind of investment into an offensive line, then as a group, as a collection of parts, you're going to have some talent up front. And that's the thing about an offensive line. You can have one really good offensive lineman and overall a crap offensive line.
Went out there again there, Rob.
They do have a very, very good offensive line there, and good to see Jack Conklin getting his reward with a nomination there. And I'm sure that if they can keep that group together, then they've got a chance to have a very good offensive line for years to come.
And who do you see as 2017's Conklin, Elliott, maybe Hill? Who do you see as the guys that can have an impact early on, as opposed to needs time to grow? And any of those guys perhaps fitting along with the Seattle Seahawks?
Well, in terms of offensive linemen, I would expect Garrett Bowles to have, an instant impact. I don't see any reason why he can't do that. I know a lot of people like Ryan Ramczyk. I'm less excited about him than Garrett Bowles, but in terms of tackles who can come in and have an impact, there's 2 for you there. Zeke Elliott, I mean, there's going to be comparisons made. Leonard Fournette is just a phenomenal player, and as long as Leonard Fournette lands on a team that isn't completely useless on offense and asking him to be everything on offense, then he's got a chance. I mean, the thing about Zeke Elliott is, Dallas were a 12-win team that then became a 4-win team, and then they get a chance to draft Zeke Elliott behind a superb offensive line, and they get Dak Prescott as well. I mean, it was the perfect storm for Zeke Elliott. I mean, there's no way that Leonard Fournette is going to get that kind of an environment to play in unless he's drafted by someone like Carolina. And even them, they haven't got an offensive line anywhere near as good as Dallas's. So, whether the Fournettes and Dalvin Cooks, for example, can have the same kind of impact as Zeke Elliott remains to be seen, but they will have an opportunity. In the mock draft I put out yesterday, I had Dalvin Cook going to Cincinnati, and that could be a good move for him, because they're a team that's kind of had a down year, but they're still a talented team. They've got some weapons there. And if you could put Dalvin Cook on the same offense as AJ Green, then they would look really dynamic next year. And there's just so much defensive talent as well that you would imagine is going to have an impact in this draft. So many good edge rushers, so many good safeties. It's going to be such like I mentioned a couple of times now, such a fun draft to follow along here. And the combine, I think there's going to be. Last year the combine wasn't the most exciting because there weren't a lot of freaky athletes in this class, but this draft is pretty different. I think we're going to see some really explosive talent on both sides of the ball, and it's going to make for a very interesting combine.
I heard that Jamal Adams, the safety out of Tennessee, had declared, and just someone saying that he reminded them of Calvin Pryor, the safety for the Jets, and that's not very exciting to start thinking about. Though I think some people also say that Jamal Adams is a top 10 pick. I'm just curious if what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I think he's a sort of top 15 guy. Could easily go in the top 10. I think I had him at number 10. Number 10 in my last mock draft yesterday. Yeah, I did add him at number 10. So, I mean, I know that there are some people like Tony Pauline has him, I think, as a second round type of guy. I've seen others sort of projecting him to go very, very early. I think he's going to be better. I wasn't particularly blown away by Pryor when he was coming out, because he was more of just a hard hit. I mean, he was like a walking fine waiting to happen when he was at Louisville. And you could say, yeah, okay, if you're willing to take 15-yard penalties every time, and you're willing to sort of watch him headhunt a little bit, then yeah, by all means draft him. But that side of the game is kind of gone away now. Maybe he would have been a better player 20 years ago. You have to be a safety position now. Is you have to be quick, you have to be alert, you have to be instinctive, you have to be a playmaker, you have to be able to cover a lot of ground. And that was never really Pryor's game. Adams has got a more all-round skill set, and that he's got some of the physicality. He can also cover. He can be a bit of a playmaker as well. So, and he's a good tackler. He's not a headhunter; he's a tackler. So, I think that he's destined to have a pretty good career.
All right, I think we've touched on most of everything that we want to touch on. The NFL playoff wild card weekend, the Seahawks-Lions, the bowl championship, the draft a little bit with players declaring, and sort of where things stand. And, I think we can really get into that after we know where the Seahawks are going to be drafting, which will become slightly more clearer after this weekend if they win, and very clear if they lose. That game at 5:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time in Seattle, Seahawks versus Lions. If the Seahawks win, it will not. And this was I always think about these things too, which is as upset or disappointed as you can be in the Seahawks not getting a bye week. Winning won't necessarily make up for that, but winning the next two games will basically make it inconsequential. Either they will be going to Dallas, which would have been the case if they had gotten the bye week, or they will be hosting a team, which would have been the case if they hadn't gotten the bye week, or if they will either way. So if it's not going to the Dallas Cowboys, it'll be hosting a team, because that means they would have been the top seeded team after knocking out the Falcons if they get that far. So the Seahawks can get back to square one with the winning the next two games, but they can get back to square two if they beat the Lions. And then we can stop thinking about our frustrations and realize maybe they are close to getting, because not every Super Bowl champion looks like a Super Bowl champion up until the moment that they are Super Bowl champions. That's as true for the Seahawks as it is for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who I think have a lot of flaws, outside of their big three players, or the Atlanta Falcons, who, have the MVP almost certainly with Matt Ryan. I mean, I'm speaking in terms of who's going to win the award, not necessarily my opinion, which might probably still be Matt Ryan. I don't really know, and I don't really think about it too much. They still have problems on defense. They still have, ways to be beaten, which the Seahawks did earlier this year. I definitely think the Green Bay Packers are flawed. I picked the New York Giants perhaps to go all the way to the Super Bowl, but their offense is very flawed. So there's still a lot of teams out there. I think that there's 8 teams that can win the Super Bowl right now legitimately, and then 4 less so. I don't think the Lions can. I don't think the Lions can win a Super Bowl with the worst defense in the NFL. So that's where I sort of stand right now, and I think that we can start to get back on track for feeling happy about the Seahawks in the playoffs if they just win this game and get to the divisional round for the 5th straight year. Something extremely difficult to do. I think that something that the Detroit Lions haven't been to in 25 years. I'm sure that a lot of people, that are listening to this podcast or whatever, there's a lot of people out there who, wouldn't have been old enough or weren't born yet to see the last time the Lions won a playoff game. I certainly wasn't really cognizant of the NFL in 1991. So here we are. And I think that's where we sort of stand with the Seahawks. Rob, any final thoughts?
Well, I'd just like to hope the Seahawks can find some form, Kenny. It's not been evident there for a few weeks now. They're missing a couple of key players, at least in Earl Thomas and Tyler Lockett. But fingers crossed they can bring things together and have a good day against Detroit and try and get a bit of momentum going here. It's going to be very difficult to get to a Super Bowl. Not overly optimistic they're going to do it this year. I've felt that way for a while now, but we've got to see what happens, and it'll all start with this Detroit game tomorrow.
There you have it. This is for fieldgoals.com and Seahawksdraftblog.com. Myself, Kenneth Arthur, can be found on Twitter at Kenneth Arthur S, or the account for our site at Field Goals. Always stuff going up at sportsonearth.com, rollingstone.com/sports. Hey, I got an interview with Hannibal Buress right now on Esquire.com, so go check out that interview with Hannibal Buress that I did, one of my favorite comedians. And check that out, and go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staton. And, hopefully you've listened to this before Seattle's playoff game against the Lions, which happens 24 hours from me saying these very words. Sorry for, the late edition of the podcast this week. Hopefully the Seahawks give us an opportunity to talk about another playoff game in the divisional round if they should win and go to Atlanta to repeat their, trip that they made 5 years ago in the divisional round when Russell Wilson's rookie season, just with a different outcome if they should advance past the Detroit Lions. Don't want to look past the Detroit Lions at all. Just something that we're hoping for, another chance after Saturday. So that's it. There you have it. This has been one edition of the podcast. Stay tuned and come back next week for a new draft.